Good evening, welcome. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Welcome to the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities here at the University of Tulsa. I'm Zenya Kish, Associate Director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities and a professor in media studies here at TU. And we're excited to welcome you into our fall programming, which is well underway now. We are continuing to do our public talks here at Tiro on Thursday evenings, and we also invite you to come join us downtown at the Zero Center for Arts and Education, where we have exhibits and some events and all sorts of things happening simultaneously in the Arts District. So our mission at OCH is really to foster and develop community engaging, intellectual and artistic community engaging urgent questions, bringing the tools of the arts and humanities to thinking about many of the urgent issues that face us today. Our central theme this year is freedom. So each year we organize a seminar, a year-long seminar that runs with faculty, students, and public fellows, exploring this theme through a range of seminar work, classwork, reading, and public events. We also hold a large range of public talks throughout the year, and we are now broadening our programming through the Zero Center with more art exhibits, musical performances, and other hybrid and creative types of events. So I'd like to just draw your attention to our next upcoming big event, which will take place on October 7th and 8th at the Zero Center downtown. We are kicking off an exhibit and two-day symposium on the musical legacies of the Dust Bowl. So we will, starting on the evening of October 7th, during our First Friday programming, we'll have talks starting on the 7th and running over into the 8th. On a whole range of interesting panels, topics, historical, archival material, thinking about musical cultures and also musical technologies that grew out of that confluence of the Great Depression, the climate disaster of the Dust Bowl, and then the rise of new electric musical technologies. So please join us October 7th and 8th for that. I'm very happy to welcome here tonight GerShun Avilez, who joins us from the University of Maryland. He's a professor of English and the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. He specializes in African American studies, Black diasporic literature, and visual cultures. His work really bridges a wide range of work, thinking about how gender and sexuality inform artistic production in a whole range of moments in time and different artistic contexts. He also works on a range of areas involving political radicalism, spatial theory, gender studies, medical humanities, and is engaged in two book projects at the moment. One looking at radical aesthetics and modern Black nationalism, and the other, which he will speak from today, looks at a mid-century historicization of Black queer freedom, thinking about queer artists and social space. So thank you very much for joining us.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I want to start by thanking Sean Aletha for inviting me, and the Center for having me here, and Emily Everett for doing all the work, and Sarah Bean for being my guide and friend. So I'm excited to talk a little bit with you tonight. So I'm going to be giving you what is basically kind of an essay I've written as part of a project, thinking about how we write about Black queer past and Black queer history, or no, actually queer past queer history generally. And so I'll be happy to take kind of any questions or thoughts you have about this. The talk is going to focus really on ideas about the Cold War, as you will hear, and how we think about queerness and liberation in the context of that. In his 1946 speech, The Sinews of Peace, Winston Churchill outlines the principles that would come to define the Cold War. The speech is primarily about the significance of the newly formed United Nations to protecting peace across the globe, but it is often seen as the rhetorical crystallization of the Cold War's core ideas. Churchill points out that there are two great dangers that face the world: war and tyranny. The two are interrelated because it is the fear of the spread of tyranny that leads to war. Churchill asserts that an iron curtain has descended across the continent, dividing Europe into two distinct halves and containing the spread of communism. His point is that there will be definite tensions between these two entities, communist tyranny and democratic freedom. Later, he explains that those in the audience must seek to prevent arbitrary control upon the thoughts of men. This statement is particularly important because it identifies how the period of ongoing conflict that would follow World War II will be an ideological conflict rather than an active military engagement. The communist threat endangers a way of life and perceived sense of shared identity. Part of the danger of the tyranny is the possible tyrannical control of one's mind in everyday life. Allen Dulles, director of the CIA from 1953 to 1961, warned the country about communist brainwashers. He insisted that everyone must fight against ideas or actions that might make people's minds vulnerable to manipulation or control. The dominant concern of the period can be summed up in a simple question: what ideology would organize society? New ideas come to be seen as dangerous in this context, and conformity and compliance with norms were thought to make one safe and ensure peace. Both government officials and private individuals sought to control activities and behaviors that might compromise a person's mind or deviate from social norms because they might jeopardize the overall state and fate of the global struggle. Queer sexuality becomes a particularly vexed issue in this historical context. One is left to wonder, what are the possibilities of queer identity and connection within this cultural environment of seemingly ubiquitous oppression created by this war of ideas? To answer this question, I track how literary texts published during the Cold War era take up the subject of homosexuality. I show how texts shift from presenting queer figures as alone in a social threat, replicating the popular and legal discourse about homosexuality, switching from that to embodying dissent and communal connection, reflecting the radical activism that emerged later in the century in response to the oppression of minorities. In this talk, I illuminate how, over the course of the Cold War, the active repression of gender and sexual nonconformity incites the expression of lived dissent, or the refusal of conformity and the public claiming of queer identity as a strategic embodiment of non-normativity. First, I consider texts published at the height of the Red Scare, Tennessee Williams' play Studied Last Summer, and Patricia Highsmith's novel, The Talented Mr. Ripley, text you're probably familiar with. These texts portray same-sex desire as a social problem and record an overwhelming anxiety about the characters who get aligned with such drives. They narrativize the Cold War era suspicion of sexual minorities and indicate that the hazardous nature of these ways of thinking. And next, in the second part of the talk, I turn to texts written near the end of the Cold War, specifically Audre Lorde's Zami and Sherry Moraga's Loving in the War Years. These later works situate same-sex desire as a means of radical social critique and a site of generative connection. In the process, they suggest that misused state power is the real threat. These authors find personal and collective peace by embracing queerness and queer connection. The abiding concern with mind control in the 1950s gets re-articulated as a focus on psychic and corporeal liberation during the 1980s, which is made possible by the avowal of queerness rather than its censure. Considering these works together, one discovers how queer bonds arise and flourish in the shadow of repression. There is an acute need to conceal queer sexuality during the Cold War era. Sexuality becomes connected to secrecy out of necessity. One of the key factors in this need to conceal queerness is that homosexuality was understood to be a threat to national security. Historian Eric Servini explains, a slide for this quotation here. In March 1947, President Truman established a federal loyalty program, and the government began investigating its employees to determine their loyalty. 3 months later, the Democrat-controlled Senate Committee of Appropriations warned about the extensive employment in highly classified positions of admitted homosexuals, who were historically known to be security risks. The committee empowered the Secretary of State with absolute discretion to purge employees, including homosexuals, who threatened national security. This kind of thinking produced a policy and printed in newspapers made non-normative sexuality more than an issue of morals. It made it a political threat and potentially treasonous. Because in part, homosexuals were thought to be particularly vulnerable to blackmail. So that's why they were in a government position, they were kind of a danger to the entire office, but also the state. That was the thinking. Homosexuality could destroy families, and worse, could destroy the nation. Thousands were fired or resigned from their positions because of this program during the 1950s. Part of what fueled this anxiety about unseen traitors was the widespread fear of communist infiltration. The House Un-American Activities Committee, which originally created in 1938, sought to locate communists and sympathizers. The committee used its subpoena power as a weapon to force people to answer questions about themselves and those they knew. Anyone who refused to comply or answer questions to the satisfaction of the committee was labeled red and often blacklisted. And though infamously known, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin became the de facto leader of the ferreting out of the Red Menace. However, Truman's program, in the context of cultural anxieties about homosexuality, meant that the Red Scare was accompanied by a specifically lavender scare, as the attempt to discredit and blacklist homosexuals is often called. Being homosexual would put your job, your family, and even your social ties at risk. In this environment of surveillance and harsh retribution, many gays and lesbians, US citizens, began to feel under threat and even isolated, and some formed organizations to find support and campaign for change. Any organization was risky because homosexuals were persecuted. Gay activist and Army veteran Hal Call explains, quote, "Foremost in our minds was the fear of being found out or having a finger pointed at us and being just shattered by accusations and innuendos." However, even with these kinds of pressures, individuals such as Call persevered and organized. This period witnesses the development of two significant organizations focused on life and rights of sexual minorities, the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Avilez. The Mattachine Society was founded in LA in 1950 as a secret society that sought support and dignity for gay men. The Daughters of Avilez was formed in 1950 in San Francisco as a social club and a safe space for women. The group later began publishing a newsletter because of the refusal of local newspapers to advertise their meetings. And this newsletter went on to become The Ladder, the first nationally circulating lesbian publication. Both Mattachine and Avilez became national organizations, transforming from private groups to active organizations that fought for recognition in different ways. Although these organizations held symbolic value and made material differences in people's lives, there was an overall tendency to downplay difference and emphasize conventionality, even as they sought to celebrate sexual difference. Some pieces in The Ladder encouraged conformity, so much so that there were letters from subscribers complaining about this ideological leaning that lesbian women should be conforming for success. In addition, early on, drag was discouraged by some Mattachine members. There was also frustration expressed by a member. One of the members was reported as saying he was frustrated that all the quote unquote swishes, more effeminate gay men, it gave him all a bad name in the society. This quotation expresses an anxiety about gay men who are overly effeminate or deviate too far from heteromasculine norms of gender performance. In the 21st century, we might describe such thoughts as internalized homophobia or femophobia, while a genuine fear of retribution for being visibly gay lurks behind such a statement. This kind of attitude meant that even within the space of a meeting or the page of a periodical, there was an intramural attempt to contain certain expressions of queer identity. The social landscape of the Cold War is a heightened mix then of queer organizational energy and silencing. Such complex dynamics of queer repression appear vividly within texts that represent homosexual activity and same-sex attraction. Tennessee Williams' one-act play, Sunday Last Summer, showcases the kind of repression of sexuality, the danger associated with sexual nonconformity, and the need to purge from public presence such nonconformity. Written and published at the height of the Red Scare in '57, Suddenly Last Summer revolves around the character Sebastian Venable. though he died the previous summer under unclear circumstances. The play is set in the house of his mother, who has called a doctor to convince him to lobotomize Catherine, her niece. Catherine, who's currently in a mental institution, keeps talking about the events surrounding Sebastian's death and hinting at his homosexuality, as well as his use of her, Catherine, to attract and seduce young men and adolescents. By the play's end, Catherine reveals that Sebastian is unexpectedly murdered and partially consumed by mere starving youth. Here's a quotation from the play. Talking about this murder. The band of naked children pursued us up the steep white street in the sun that was like a white bone of a giant beast that had caught on fire in the sky. Sebastian started to run and they all screamed at once and seemed to fly in the air. When we got back to where my cousin Sebastian had disappeared in a flock of featherless little black sparrows, talking about the boys, he was lying naked as they had been naked. They had devoured parts of him, torn or cut parts of him away with their hands of knives, or maybe those jagged tin cans they made music with. They had torn bits of him away and stuffed them into those gobbling fears full of empty black mouths of theirs. Catherine's story suggested that the violent scene is the result of Sebastian's sexual manipulation of youth and his moral disillusion. Even though he is brutally assaulted, and the account presents Sebastian as a threatening sexual deviant, which is why Sebastian's mother tries to silence her. The mother's reaction represents a desire to repress any suggestion of sexual deviance. His mother uses medical and legal establishments as leverage in advancing heteronormative narratives, meaning she commits Catherine and then tries to have her lobotomized, and also threatens to withhold Sebastian's will to keep him from getting an inheritance. So literally uses kind of medical power and legal power to prevent this narrative from being told. The play is less about sexual deviancy per se than about the lengths to which people will go to repudiate queerness. Suddenly encapsulates Red Scare terror and the means of suppression within domestic space. The actual queer character, Sebastian, never appears on stage. He's only present in Catherine's retellings of the past. He defines the actions and thoughts of every character on stage. Sebastian suffered a terrible death, but he is spared witnessing his mother's method of controlling others and denying his actions. For some, the depiction of Sebastian as predatory or manipulative means that the play connects queerness with depravity, which the orthodoxy of the 50s believed was synonymous with homosexuality. However, Michael Pollard argues that the play presents a defense of living one's life as one wishes, rather than a negative image of homosexuality. From this perspective, what comes under scrutiny is the mother's depravity, as she seeks to expunge from memory, of course, I mean here figuratively and literally, as she wants to lobotomize her niece, expunge aspects of her son's unconventional life. It is a morality play, for sure, but by absenting Sebastian, Williams is able to focus the moral lens away from the queer character, the opposite of what McCarthy and Truman had done. The play does not celebrate Sebastian or justify his actions. Suddenly, it is a meditation on repression or on the myriad attempts to repress sexuality. The play helps us to understand the paranoia that circulated during the time period because the mere intimation of sexual impropriety could have vast ramifications. Many other texts turn away from the consideration of repression to paranoia, especially the paranoia that surrounds and defines queer characters. And actually, in the fuller piece, I then turned to James Baldwin's novel. I can't remember what is in Europe. Thank you, Giovanni's Room. I didn't talk about Giovanni's Room, but I'm not going to talk about it today for time. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to Count to Mr. Ripley, published in 1955 by Patricia Highsmith. And I think it's actually a really important novel to have this conversation of thinking about Cold War anxieties of homosexuality. The novel is the first of what will become a series of 5 books published in over nearly 40 years by Highsmith. The publication of this anthology of psychological thrillers covers the exact historical period of the Cold War and the global anxieties about ideological conflict, as well as the concerns of homosexuality, fuel the writing of Highsmith's most renowned character. She's the author of many other novels, including The Crime Story, Stranger on the Train, adapted into a film by Hitchcock in 1950, and the lesbian romance novel The Price of Salt. However, the Ripley books best illustrate the narrative treatment of Cold War dynamics. Central to the talented Mr. Ripley, and by extension all of the sequels, is an anxiety about being perceived as queer. The protagonist, Tom Ripley, is deeply paranoid about his perception of himself. The plot tracks the development and catastrophic ending of a friendship between Tom and the debonair Dickie Greenleaf. Near the beginning of the novel, Tom is enlisted by shipping tycoon Herbert Greenleaf to go to Italy and convince his wayward son to come home and help run the business. Tom is desperate for money and a new life, so he agrees to go. Arriving in Italy and quickly becoming enchanted with Dickie, Tom has gone as an envoy and spy for Dickie's father, but finds himself growing close to the subject of his mission. He also begins to resent Dickie's female friend Marge, whom he feels monopolizes Dickie's attention. Tom does all he can to get Dickie to spend time with him alone and put a wedge between him and Marge. In the novel, even the perception of queerness must be kept a secret, and the necessity of keeping it a secret becomes a defining destructive force. Tom's undeniable attraction to Dickie gets expressed as an all-encompassing identification with him. And Tom's increasing jealousy of Marge causes tension amongst the trio. The situation begins to sour when Dickie catches Tom wearing his clothes and imitating him. As Dickie waits for his friend to return from visiting Marge, he frustratingly imagines that Dickie is making love to her, insisting that Dickie would find it unsatisfactory. As he thinks about Dickie, he begins to put on his clothes, symbolically creating intimacy with his friend. After he puts on his hat, Tom realizes how much he resembles Dickie, and even begins to speak in his voice in an imaginary conversation with Marge. And it's really funny in the novel when you get to this point, because you have to kind of imagine Dickie in this closet putting on clothes and then having a conversation as as Dickie talking to the absent Marge. But he says, this is him talking to the imaginary Marge as Dickie. You were interfering between Tom and me. No, not that. But there is a bond between us. Tom, who is literally in the closet as he says this out loud, becomes Dickie, and it separates an undeniable intimate connection between the two young men. In the midst of the performance, Dickie walks in. So basically what's happening here is he's telling Marge she's interfering, and the no, not that's really important. It's intimated that there's something kind of sexual going on between them. In the midst of the performance, this kind of play that's happening in his closet, Dickie walks in, is shocked by what he sees, and tells Tom to take off his clothes. So agitated, Dickie clarifies that he's not queer, but says that Marge believes Tom is. This assertion discombobulates and panics the protagonist. He felt faint. Nobody had ever said it outright to him, not in this way. That's what he kind of says to himself. Tom cannot handle being confronted with this idea that he might be queer. However, his thoughts are not completely true. If you read the novel, you know he'd been plagued by insinuations of queerness most of his life, especially by his aunt, who taunts him mercilessly with this language. Sissy. He's a sissy from the ground up, just like his father. He heard this over and over again. So when he says it to himself that he'd never been confronted with the possibility of queerness, he's really kind of lying to himself. After a few days after the encounter in Dickie's clothes, Tom believes that Dickie again insinuates Tom's queerness when he sees several effeminate acrobats performing. Afterward, a swirl of emotions overtakes Tom. He kind of can't handle like these kinds of having to face this idea. And it's soon after the acrobat scene, when he has this sort of emotion, that Tom has his first explicit thought of murdering his friend, whom he beats to death a few days later. Together, this closed closet scene that I kind of point out here and the acrobat scene that I reference are they're kind of narratively side by side in the text. They kind of happen back to back. And together they suggest that it's Tom's own anxiety about being perceived as queer and having his perception made public that makes him anxious and desperate. After killing Dickie, Tom assumes his identity and spends the rest of the narrative trying to avoid being found out and actually killing Dickie with secret. Tom feels watched and pursued continually. The narrative becomes an extended meditation on paranoia. Suspicion and fears of persecution provide the foundation for all of the Ripley novels. Each one reflects the paranoid perspective of the that Cold War repression creates. The action of all the novels, all the murders that Tom will go on to commit, derive from this initial murder of Dickie and Tom's fear of being labeled queer by the man he arguably loved the most. The talented Mr. Ripley concerns repression and secrecy, or a narrativization of a historically specific regime of secrecy and shame. In the final analysis, Suddenly Last Summer and Talented Mr. Ripley are narratives of isolation. These characters end up being alone or isolated. The social subjection and suspicion of queer people made secrecy necessary and made it dangerous to seek out connections with others. There was always the risk of being found out. One also had to be wary of entrapment by state officials, such as police officers and FBI agents, who might pose as queer or sympathetic to those with same-sex desire to arrest people participating in lewd acts or accuse them of treasonous actions. The historical period of the Cold War, particularly the 1950s, which I'm really focusing on for the first part of this talk, becomes defined by a paradox of queerness. Authoritarian social and political tactics make it increasingly difficult for one to have queer community. But such isolation heightens the need for community. And that kind of is back and forth between being unable to have community and desperately needing it becomes the focus of the period. Cold War era queer life is marked by this exact dilemma. And this idea resonates with Heather Love's take on queer suffering, in which she argues that notions of loss, loneliness, and longing are central to representations of same-sex desire. However, my argument is that the structure of feeling apparent in these texts, which includes isolation, loneliness, and death, is not just an affective reflection of queer existence. It is also a commentary about the mid-20th century political climate that made queerness a tool of political machinations and a pawn of ideological conflict. One does not find characters or texts here that might be useful for queer organizing. These aren't inspiring characters that you want to be or model yourself after. Sebastian and Tom are not likely to be seen as good models for queer life. However, the texts from which they emerge tell us much about the social dynamics that pin queer life and that set the course for and the need for community building. There's actually a paradigmatic shift that happens in the 1960s and 70s in terms of the representation of queerness in the context of political ideologies. As the height of the Cold War wanes, one becomes aware of a tremendous reorganization of how Americans thought about identity as seen in the social activism, such as the Black Power movement, second wave feminism, the development of Chicano nationalism, the nationalist movement, and importantly for this conversation, the development of radical queer activism. So you have all these kind of social movements happening in the 60s that impact how we understand homosexuality, but also impact how people respond to repression by the state. The Red Scare begins to dwindle, but not disappear, toward the end of 1950, especially after McCarthy loses credibility after kind of criticizing the armed forces. Instead of people being shunned for connections to communism and forms of radical thought, these ideas become means of organizing, especially among younger people. There's a generational shift that happens. Counter ideologies fed activism in the United States. Some prominent members of the Black Panthers and the Chicano nationalist movement claim an affiliation with Marxist thought, and they began to be seen as integral contributors to change in the US as opposed to foreign agitators with questionable links to foreign nations. The Cold War is still going on, but organizations and activists are less interested in conformity as a path to rights. This ideological shift is made possible by the persistence of communist thought, to be honest, the linking of community organizing to grassroots activism, as well as a kind of a general disgust with the actions of the state to purge and destroy the lives of some citizens because of their beliefs and identities. Turning specifically to the issue of sexuality, following the Stonewall Uprising of '69 and the important work of groups such as Gay Liberation Front, Third World Gay Revolution, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, so these kind of groups that are happening on the ground locally around the country, we witness a polarization of the idea of being out. More artists and activists claim a right to the publicness of their sexuality and refuse notions of conventionality given the energies of many of social movements already mentioned. We find a resistance to the mechanisms of secrecy and conformity as political strategies. Gays and lesbians come to be seen as oppressed minorities, comparable to other oppressed minorities who need to work collaboratively for social change. In fact, Huey Newton's 1970 statement that, and he says this, homosexuals may be the most oppressed group of all, signals the overall rethinking of homosexuality away from moral deviance toward a marginalized social position. Part of what queer activists did was work against the repression that Cold War era politicians had continued to encourage. Given these shifts and rethinkings that happened in the 60s and 70s, one is left with the following question. How does Cold War era literature look outside of the context of the height of the Red Scare? In addition, how do authors think back on the Red and Lavender Scare as they imagine new ways for representing queerness? To address these questions and move to the second part of the talk, I considered two texts briefly published near the end of the Cold War, as I said, Zami and Loving in the Warriors. These texts situate lived dissent as a crucial way of expressing queerness and imagine queer connection as an essential component of being out. In addition, they privilege women's bodies and women-centered desire in place of the more kind of androcentric or male focus that defines some of the earlier texts in the century. Later texts indicate that an emphasis on queer sensuality and bodies can free one from constraints. They shift attention from Churchill's anxieties about control of the mind to a purposeful liberation of the body. Audre Lorde was an influential Black writer and activist. She's best known for her poetry collections such as the Black Unicorn, the essay collection Sister Outsider, and her meditation on illness, the Cancer Journal. The book Zami is unique in her corpus. It is a memoir of her childhood through her young adulthood that she calls a biomythography, meaning that she uses fictional strategies in the documenting the autobiographical documents of her life. It's often read as a significant text of Black feminism that contemplates African American and Caribbean women's lives through the expression of a persona named Audre. Although written in the 70s and published in 1982, the primary historical focus of the narrative is the same as Sunny Last Summer and The Talented Mr. Ripley, the 1950s. The book is about lesbian sexual awakening and racial tension, but it's also a novel about a Black lesbian's life in a specific context of Cold War ideological pressures. Woven throughout the text are concerns about how the anti-communist anxieties in the US seek to snuff out Audre's burgeoning political and sexual consciousness in multiple ways, as the protagonist points to out the ongoing racism that exists for Black people even after World War II, or especially after World War II. Audre participates in a Communist Party organization, the Labor Youth League, as a means of socializing and as a way to reflect her own radicalism. On one occasion, FBI agents show up at her door looking for a friend of hers, and Audre is highly aware of the danger of their coming to the door because, in her words, it was 1952, the height of the McCarthy era. In this instance and many others, the lessons that Audre quickly learns is that non-conventional people can be dangerous, even in the gay community. Yeah. Her response to this realization is to embrace unconventionality and embody joyously the threat she is assumed to be. Lorde's Zami is quite distinct from the 1950 text that I've kind of talked about briefly today. Audre is not overburdened by the shame of her desire or actions. She doesn't die, nor is she murdered for her appetites like Sebastian. She doesn't lash out when confronted with the presumption of her queerness like Tom. In fact, she is confronted publicly by her sexuality, and when that happens, she develops a new friendship and these medallions. Audre's sexual desire becomes, for her, a means of affiliation, not a means of isolation. If the other narratives are about loneliness, Lorde's text is about connection. Audre has many love connections over the course of the narrative, none of which works out long term. However, the connections are genuine and impactful. After spending a few faithful nights together, the two, oh, I missed one. One of the most important encounters she has is with the woman who calls herself Aphrodite. After they spend a couple of nights together, the two part, but Audrey insists that Aphrodite's print remained upon her life with the resonance and power of an emotional tattoo. This line is the final one of the text before the epilogue. Rather than ending on a note of paranoia, guilt, or destructive loss, harmony and satisfaction with what was and what could be is what rounds up the narrative. Here, queer desire is beneficial and valuable rather than threatening. As it embraces the ostensible danger of homosexuality, the text stresses the significance of having a public sexual identity that marks one as deviant. Zami is less interested in charting sexual acts, though there's a lot of sex in the novel or the book, than in creating narrative space for the articulation of a queer identity for Audrey. Through her relationships with women, she learns to be what she calls dyke proud. Over the course of the chapters, Lord seeks to undo the socially and patriotically endorsed silences that are forced upon Audrey. And part of what is given voice to is woman-centered desire. The desire becomes a means of escaping from the restrictive realities of the time, means of reimagining the present outside the restrictive logics that govern her life. This idea takes us back to how Lord characterized the text as a biomythography. Again, the infix there, the infix mytho, placed inside the word biography, suggests the mythologizing of self. Lord does rely upon Karaku cultural figures, kind of like folklore figures, mythic figures, the Zami, along with references of the female warrior figure, Amazon, and providing a foundation for her queer identity. However, her weaving in mytho is not simply about the implication of cultural myth into her life. That does happen, that's not all that happens. As mythos also denotes a belief system. Lord's term, the very term biomythography, also registers her attempt to assert a set of beliefs and a value system through her life writing. The narrative puts forward an ideology that is rooted in woman-centered desire and offers a path to radicalism that can unseat Cold War tactics. Churchill's speech makes the point about a battle for the control of men's minds. Lord shifts paradigmatic focus to the body. McCarthyism is the subtext for Zami, and the articulation of self in the biomythography is as much an exploration of a singular life as it is a narrative dismantling of the homophobic anxiety that drove policy development and the social organization of society. Audrey refuses to hide her identity, and she uses her narrative to limb the value of queer bond. I close this talk with a brief consideration of Teddy Moraga's lyrical and intense work, Loving in the War Years. Published a year after Zami, Moraga's hybrid text made up of poems, essays, and journal entries is a classic work of lesbian Chicanx writing. Like Lord's memoir, Loving in the War Years is driven by a feminist investment in the idea that the person was political. The work is a memoiristic manifesto, which puts kinship relations and romantic desire in the foreground and contemplation of the state in the background. The decision itself is a strategic one Moraga makes to place state repressions by displacing the state itself for the interpersonal. For example, the poem that contemplates fear, called Fear, a love poem, imagines a deep connection that could clean out the most miserable part of myself, quoting from the poem. The deep connection that could clean out the most miserable parts of myself, instead of anxieties about exposure or arrest. The poem situates fear as an affective response that results from intimacy between two women rather than the control of state power over an individual. Fear here is not an instrument of state power. It is re-theorized as a mechanism of queer bonds. This extended sharing of a person's most intimate experiences and insight is exactly what McCarthy and government panels wanted. They wanted that showing of yourself to be able to control you. Moraga uses this confessional mode as a way to claim knowledge and power for herself, as opposed to being rendered vulnerable. We should read works such as Moraga's and Lord's as refusing the fear the state hoped to instill in being public about sexuality. In framing the text, Moraga employs war as the metaphor and context for queer relations. In the title poem, Moraga's speaker asserts, "Loving you is like living in the war years." Moraga uses the language and imagery of war to talk about a romantic entanglement. The broken world, quote, with bombs outside is forgotten in favor of the presence of passionate and sometimes maddening desire. The speaker in the poem mentions risk, but this risk concerns the uncertainty of the relationship itself. The poem ends by asserting that maintaining that the wartime morality of being queer and female is the most warlike thing one can do. There is no bigger challenge than being queer and female in this context. But the point is not that it makes one vulnerable to the point of social paralysis or needing to conceal oneself. In this poem and throughout the collection, Moraga is not explicitly talking about living in the Cold War, during the Cold War years. However, Cold War repression is the ideological foundation through which and beyond which she writes her reflections on intimacy and interiority. Queer loving in the Cold War years, to quote her, calls for this kind of risking without a home to call our own. This sense of homelessness and risk describes effectively the men's lives in Sunday last summer and the challenge of Mr. Ripley. However, Moraga turns to queer desire instead of away from it to ground her poetic personas. The text as a whole is an extended documentation of queer life, both challenges and pleasures, and it makes a lyrical demand for the public life of queer desire in its specificity that is almost unspeakable decades before. The Cold War officially ends with dismantling of the Berlin Wall in 1991 and opening of borders and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. However, writers such as Lord and Moraga augur the ideological dismantling of the Cold War through their embrace of the power of queer desire. The Cold War may not have been about queer desire, but those in power use queerness as a mechanism of control. To reroute queerness as a tool of freedom or liberation and for the articulation of the value of social difference indicates a weakening of the ways of thinking that made the Cold War itself possible. Reading Zami and Loving in the War Years allows one to see the cultural impact of social activism. Moreover, through these texts, the 21st century reader can also recognize how dissent becomes the foundation for literary and critical conceptions of queer positionality. And this understanding, which would emerge more explicitly in 1990s queer theory, is rooted in artistic attention to Cold War deployments of same-sex desire. Thanks for listening. So I think we have plenty of time for questions, comments, or critiques or thoughts. And I'm happy to talk, about anything I've just laid out. I'm also happy to talk about any of the work I've done in my previous books as well, or just about anything I want to talk about. I'm kind of here. Go ahead.
When you were talking about Zami, you mentioned there were kind of different approaches. Sounds like she pulls in poetry. What are some of the other things?
Well, Zami is mostly, we read it as kind of like a memoir. So it kind of works like that. But Loving the Warriors is made up of like essays and poetry, kind of different genres kind of blended together.
How do you see that breaking down some of the Cold War restrictive kind of elements that kind of going between different genres and forms?
Yeah, that's actually a beautiful question. Thank you for that. I think in many ways my answer is just to return to your point. I think this artistic attempt to work to undermine the boundaries between genres, to work across those kind of generic formal boundaries, is that transgression, like it kind of actually, that artistic strategy models a kind of transgression I'm talking about kind of more theoretically in the text. So I think it is quite fitting, which is why I appreciate your question, to think about the formal choices they make to work across forms, or even the very idea of Lord creating a new form that she calls a biomythography. Like there's no form that can quite capture her life, which when so much of the Red Scare was about not about surveillance, but also kind of being defined and having your life defined in a certain way, being put within certain kind of boundaries. These texts that push on boundaries and make us question kind of what constitutes a genre, what constitutes a genre, what constitutes a biography, is actually itself an argument against that kind of movement. So yeah, that's a really good point that I don't actually say here, but you're exactly right to point that out, that they're both genre questioning texts. And I'm using those to talk about texts that are also questioning kind of social boundaries, right? Social categories. So thank you for that. You want to follow? I don't know if you have to follow.
No, that was great.
No, well, it's really your question.
I was actually kind of struck by how a lot of the narrative really has not changed much, actually, in 50, 70 years or something at this point, right? Because especially when you're talking about fairness and the political climate that we have here, especially when you're talking about that the narrative of decency and predatoriness is even the under, not necessarily specifically said as a pedophilic sort of, obviously, that's what we want, right? But it's interesting even more in the context of trying to help educators who are in public schools still be able to provide resources for their kids in this sort of scary provide these resources for them to try to have their position. It's not as terrible as in the Cold War, but it is some sort of history repeating itself.
So your question comment is about the idea of how similar some of this sounds like 50, 7 years later, how similar it is to the world we're living in now, almost as if history is repeating itself. How do we think about that? And I think you're exactly right. And part of why I like this kind of point is it makes us ask ourselves, how far are we actually outside of Cold War life? Now, whether or not the Cold War is going on, part of what happens, and the point I'm trying to make is part of what happens in the Cold War is the very idea of the kind of the predatory nature of the homosexual and the kind of depravity isn't new, but during this period, it becomes a particularly powerful tool of the state, right? And the state using it, instrumentalizing it very actively, and that's something we're very familiar with. And that somehow hasn't changed. So this is why, in some ways, Churchill's right. This war of ideas, or this kind of ideological focus, again, whether or not we're in that war of ideas, that way of thinking that became dominant then still haunts our present. There's still these ways of thinking, even if powers have shifted, or if we're kind of in another phase of that Cold War now. The ways of thinking that dominated. My argument in this piece is that queer writers kind of push against that way of thinking, but your point is true. That way of thinking still kind of permeates our lived experience and still exists and flows in terms of policy making right now. So that's why it can again, text written 7 years ago can sound like eerily similar to things we're happening or talking about on the news or thinking about banned books. So I think you're right, and I would respond to the point by saying there's a way in which we are pushing against these ways of thinking, but we're still kind of stuck in it, or we haven't fully divested ourselves from this kind of either the characterization of queerness, nor have we divested ourselves of the state utilizing these ways of thinking to actually shape all of our everyday life. That's a good point. Thank you for that. Maybe the Cold War never ended, to some extent. Don't feel pressure.
It's good to see you.
I have no idea who's talking.
That's Carl James.
Oh my God! Oh, that's crazy. Good to see you too. It's like an interview in here.
This is wonderful.
Oh, now I'm really nervous. It's called I hope that's what happened.
The sort of the thing that a lot of us have read all these historical texts, right? And sort of thought about it, especially as queer people and as queer activists, as ways to sort of fight back against power, sort of these great collectives to fight the power. And I'm curious, I don't know if I've ever read anything where there were actual like examples of ways that sort of queerness or attachments to like intellectualism or communism could sort of undermine the state. Like, were they just like using us as a scapegoat without any sort of like actual points? So were there like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I've only read sort of like aftertext where people, were just like, fuck you, like this is, like federal use as a scapegoat. But were there actual examples of, State Department or Foreign Service or like people being used for their relationships that were gay relationships?
Oh, I follow.
Like
Yeah.
Using people who were in the closet to sort of pressure them. Were there actual examples of
Okay.
people that they were able to use? I don't think I've ever encountered anything like that. Because that's also not.
Yeah. So Paul's question is there's kind of this anxiety about the using queer people for like blackmail or making the state vulnerable if there are actual examples of it. And there actually is one. And I'm blanking on the reference, but there was like this one person who was working for the state, I think for Russia, who was queer and actually was manipulated. I'll actually get the reference and send it to you. But what your question points to is that largely no. It was largely this anxiety about what could happen. And so, and then the scapegoating of the queer figure, because it was actually, there was a lot, this is not really referenced in this talk, but there were lots of regulations, but a lot of firing happened. Like here's people a day would get fired for being actually out and queer or like admittedly queer or like that thought. So there was a lot of that happening. So, but it was like this one early case. And Eric Savini talked about in his book, like that really kind of set people off. But then from like one that in a one becomes like an actual like emptying out of federal offices that happens. That is not about actual cases of that manipulation happening, and more about this kind of conjoined anxiety about that vulnerability, and also just plain old homophobia. Like that's also part of what's eating. So I think that it was more about anxiety for control and normativity than anything else, and actually being this happening over and over again because there wasn't. That's not. But thank you for that question. Go ahead.
Related question. Of course, the only reason blackmailing exists, especially in the class to begin with, is within a culture that doesn't states or other people. So it's like the creation of state that enables that. I think that's blackmailing. But lately, I was wondering, one of the interesting things about surveillance that is designed to create problems for minorities who are not accepted within the mainstream culture, is that surveillance can be a way of like putting extra attention on that group, but it also enables the neglect of that group, erasure of that group, alienation. So it's a way of like the extra attention is also a way of conflict and trying to create a scenario in which actually that for all practical purposes does exist within public consciousness. And I wonder if you have thoughts about, I really love the talk, I should say, all these authors. I wonder if you have thoughts about the theme of neglect or erasure as it
I do. Thank you, Dante. It's a beautiful question. That is beautiful. So this idea that this intense surveillance simultaneously puts extra attention on the population, but in some ways also erases them, but also homogenizes them, which is a form of erasure, and then leads to your final point about neglect, like how neglect or erasure is part of this conversation. I think that's actually a really helpful way to think about the way in which surveillance is destructive, not just because it is invasive, but also because it flattens and simplifies, ultimately, it kind of erases or kind of erases through attention. That's kind of the point. I think I'm particularly interested in this notion of neglect, because I think that both perceived and actually material neglect is what fuels so much activism. So I think what we see happen in the 60s and 70s, and we see realized in late literary text, is itself a response to erasure and neglect, like trying to write yourself into existence. So I think that is actually not language I use at all here, but it's actually in many ways you're pointing out the subtext for the second part of my argument, like how do people like Lord Monaga respond to what are decades of neglect for themselves and their communities, and effectively are writing about abuses that are themselves attempts to erase identity. That's just again, it's a wonderful reading. That's not even a question, it's just like something I could have said, but you said it better. Thank you for that. Yes.
Something, a couple of things that we talked about that are but during the 20th century in the United States, we see, and I think it's largely people who are working and politics, there's this proliferation of the suburb, so like physical construction, but also as like the social system. And so I'm wondering if the suburb itself is excluded in this space, that's keeping the economic. So have you done thinking some interesting social things about kind of black queer identity and what the existing and the navigation of these kinds of various spaces?
Thank you for that question. So a part of the question, make sure I get this right, is thinking about the proliferation of suburbs, but the suburbs as themselves as class and racialized spaces, and how, if I, essentially which I thought about that as part of this larger kind of way of thinking, or just my work in general, maybe what you're pointing to. So I love this question because part of what your question points to is a concept I don't talk about in this paper, but I think a lot about, and that's actually whiteness. So what I don't talk about in this essay explicitly is race, but you'll probably notice the first authors I talk about are actually white authors, and then I end with a Black and Latinx author. So there's a way in which this way of thinking about queerness is actually racialized, although I don't mark it as such explicitly in my discussion. I promise I won't get to the suburb part. But there is something going on about racial thinking that's part of this conversation. So thank you for bringing that to the conversation. And so, but I would answer that question about the suburb by thinking about the way in which not only do spaces get encoded as or racialized, but also how urban spaces are further racialized by the proliferation of suburbs you're talking about. And so it's interesting, particularly with Ward's work, how much of that book is really about New York and Connecticut, but actually these particular kind of urban spaces. And what's funny is, and I guess I think the value that the literary texts add to your very thoughtful question is the proliferation of suburbs creates this idea that of this white flight, like the movement of white bodies and rich white bodies away from more urban spaces. But that kind of social organization, geographic organization doesn't undermine the complex of racial dynamics within urban spaces themselves, meaning there's still whiteness and racism in the urban spaces. And so I guess my response to that is to kind of say, you're exactly right. That's kind of part of the conversation, but I'm also interested in these texts and how, even in the context of that movement of white bodies, the experience of racism is unchanged in those spaces that are left behind by white flight, right? There's still this experience of highly racialized, both what we might call urban spaces and like the semi-urban spaces, space that exists between urban and suburban spaces that are like kind of partially urban, that even in that dynamic is happening, but even in heavily kind of minoritized areas, the experience of, like, for example, anti-Black racism, it remains kind of highly entrenched and it's kind of taken off in this context. So I think, and that's not to push back at all of what you're saying, is to have us think about how, regardless of the movement of white bodies, like, for example, one example, anti-Black racism remains kind of a constant in the 20th century. And then perhaps in a weird and like inverse way, gets exacerbated by something like white flight. Or there's a way in which it moves along with, but doesn't stay tethered to white communities. That's my thought. Yeah, but thank you for that. That's a really good point. I actually just love the question too, because part of what you're also adding to the conversation is a more explicit consideration of space and geography, and how, again, whether or not this speaks to it, in my larger work, I do a lot of work on geography and space, and I think that I'm often thinking about how race and gender, how they signify, how they mean and mean differently as we think about questions of geography and space. So I'm glad that was the conversation. Oh, you better shirt on.
Yeah,
Oh, okay, cool. I teach there.
yeah,
I
I
see
see
you.
class.
Go Terps.
Class for professor.
What's his name?
J.B.
No, I'm about to hear your last name.
J.B. I didn't say that's good.
Okay.
But yeah.
Glad to see you here.
Yeah. So my question was kind of similar to that one, but I was actually this from the class I learned a lot querying the intersectionality, and I realized from my pre-international background that I realized like during the queer movement in outside the US and other countries that we learned from here, and people, especially a lot of my friends from Taiwan, they identify themselves as queer intersectionality. They are called queer, but when they learn interpreting the movement, they actually tend for like or what they did back in the day, trying to not victimize what like queer nationalism in the US people did here, and they trying to be like but at this point, like, so when they're doing the queer movement, they say like they're going to do that. But on the other hand, when at this point, probably you want to use that to protect yourself to like queer criminality. So I think for the queer movement, the cohort of experience to other cultures, like some of it we're supposed to have like really good clear, but first one we can bring other stuff. To kind of deny their own culture, and when the queer movement come back, and they were like, some of the countries they're supposed to have their own culture, queer culture to like possibly, but they did not choose to use them instead to impose the something like their case about like how do people recognize themselves.
Thank you. So it's an interesting question. It's about thinking about queer sexuality, but also how we can understand that idea in the context of queer movements outside the US and the ways in which people identify and understand themselves as part of that larger movement. And I think that's a two-part question that I probably can't really justice to. But the way I want to answer it is to point out how complex the histories of queer activism is across the world. So, and as I was thinking about how queer organizing is always ongoing, right? There's a way in which it's happening. And then the part of your comment was about the different ways people might identify with, either identify themselves or identify with activism. And I'm also hearing I'll say the imprint activism in the US has globally in sense of how people understand what they're doing. And so I'll just say this, I love to do a lot of work on South Africa as well. My second book has a portion of it is about South Africa. So I'm really interested in thinking about how this queerness how does it signify there. And it was really important for me to both understand queerness on the ground, not to understand it only in the terms of US, understand on the ground there, but also think about the way I had to do how to understand the two countries' histories side by side. So I think the way I would respond to your answer was one, to recognize that how challenging and sometimes strategic people are in how they identify. Like it is people, you identify, you understand yourself and your activism or whatever in different ways, but sometimes it might be out of convenience if you redefine yourself or strategically. But I also want to say I love thinking about these kinds of questions outside the US context, because it really encourages us to think about how simultaneously different the experience of queerness can be in different places. And that's really, but that's also, to be fair, even different states, right? In this United States can be different, but I think how important it is then but also to kind of keep in mind the possibilities for resonance across those differences. And I think and you're making me think about my own kind of methodology and trying to write about Black queerness diasporically, which is what I do in my second book. Like how do I make sense of experiences which are kind of just materially different, histories of colonization that are very, very different, but then find a way to articulate kind of a resonance to be able to talk about them together. I think I've kind of not fully responded to your question, but I'm really just saying kind of things you made me think about in your topic, and I appreciate this turn to this conversation around queer identity and intersectionality outside of the U.S. nation state. I think that's actually helpful to have on the table, and it's important. In this talk, I am kind of focused on, even though it's about the Cold War, I'm focused on U.S. writers, but much of my work is thinking about how to put U.S. writers in conversation with writers from Canada and the Caribbean and South Africa and the UK. So I'm very interested in thinking about that experience and the ways in which we can understand, even something like queer intersectionality takes on a different kind of weight when we think about different kind of linguistic and cultural history, like what that actually means. That kind of gets to your point, but thank you so much, I appreciate it. There's nothing else. I hope I'm not gonna just hang out with people and ask the questions or talk, but, oh, wait, one more.
Well, let me, I don't know if I want to go down this road. I'm just thinking about it.
Now I'm scared.
But thinking about people, queer people in particular, who were dehumanized, et cetera, for certain types of actions that were considered like appropriate for sort of like hetero men at the same time, right? People who were fired from university positions or whatever for enterprises with younger students. And that was like a thing that you would get fired for because it was queer. Like, I don't think that we saw those types of things happening with like straight college, right? So like, I guess my question is like, I'm so sorry.
No, I'm getting more and more free.
But you're thinking about neglect, I mean, like thinking about it and like trying to understand like the Me Too movement and like getting to that, like this movement out of the Cold War and into a place of power. Like, how do we navigate that transition from perhaps the neglect that was happening sort of because of the isolation, because of the sort of like excess, to a place where we can talk about sort of the imperfect ways in which people existed before but were held up to different standards. Wow, I'm like not playing that really well right now, but
Well, can I tell you what I think I heard?
yeah.
So this might not be off of part of what I heard you talking about is like, what does it mean to have a population or community that has been kind of defined by this neglect and abuse, be at a moment in history when some members of those communities are feeling a place of privilege. And you know, and so that's it's okay if that. Yeah, so I think so that's really important because it's true, and that what the question forces us to think about is, or it resists or keeps us from understanding queerness as, by definition, a space of vulnerability, right? Doesn't mean because we can't, precisely because of the intersectionality we're just talking about, we can't always understand every person who's queer is always already being in a space of vulnerability, like not having a possibility of privilege. But that reality makes some notions of kind of the movement or activism really complicated. Like what I was thinking about when you were saying about when you think about kind of Me Too, when you think about that in the context of let's say gay men involved in that, or gay men abusing other gay men, like how do we think about organizing when it's not like an easy black and white good and bad. I think that's actually where we are now in terms of social organizing, trying to find a language. And then Carl, I'm so far off, forgive me, but you made me think about how do we find a language to describe and intersectionality kind of becomes that to do that, to describe that reality of trying to recognize the reality of neglect and abuse, but also recognize this imbalance of power that can exist in that community as well. Let me not speak in, let me be more specific. So, for example, there's some really interesting work now on Black conservatives. There's a really good book that just came out by Eric Edwards, thinking about how do we make sense of Black conservatives, and of course, I'll stop there. How do we think about that? So, because on one hand, we can think in this country about African Americans as being kind of bereft of social power, social access, and as always, kind of on one side of the political line. But then you have, and of course, always this, but you have very prominent in the late 20th century, 21st century, kind of Black conservatives who have a lot of social capital and a lot of power, and they seem to operate kind of against what we might think of as like the good of the whole or whatever. And they pose, for some people, they pose a problem, the social logic, how we understand race relations and power relations. But I think and analog to that would be kind of queer conservatives. I'm not trying to pick on conservatives necessarily, I'm just giving an example of a community that has been seen kind of one way, and kind of people inhabit different kind of spaces from that location. And I think those kind of those points become challenges for us to understand differently how we think about activism and how we understand stuff like vulnerability. I don't think a Black conservative doesn't have access to like vulnerability, doesn't see racism, but we can't simply then not think about other kinds of access we have. Is this really far off what you're talking about? I think it is, and you're being kind. But you're really, but part of this is, and it beautifully, I think, goes back to the point of intersectionality, how it becomes increasingly difficult for us to have simplistic understanding not only of identity, but of how we think about social organizing. And so notions of kind of collaboration and connection become important, but we also have to understand that just identity politics kind of is attractive and seems easy, but lived experience isn't. And I think that's the challenge. I think that's also why, if I am speaking kind of along what I'm talking about, I think that even the difficulty you had in kind of asking the question is because the concept itself is like thorny and it's easy. I mean, this highly educated room I'm in right now, so it can be difficult for us to kind of make sense of, well, how do we understand stuff like activism? How do we understand queer vulnerability in the context of queer people kind of voting against and working against other people's rights? Like, how do we understand that? But that's exactly what we have to kind of talk about in the 21st century. We can't not think about it another way. You want to follow up? Okay. And yeah, if I was unclear, I apologize. If not, I won't continue. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it. But I guess we're officially done. It's only 8:15. I can still hang out around here for like 10 minutes. People, I want to talk or say hi, but feel free to go back about your lives.